So, Festival has been going on for a bit now, which is giving me enough time to play Coil and figure out how he works, and what I like about him and I dislike about him. He's definitely a very unique fighter. There's a pretty high skill ceiling here, since he's got a lot of moves and potential strings he can do. It's of course easy to just do the same string over and over, but where's the fun in that? We've been given a ton of moves to use on this fighter, so you bet I'm going to actually use all those moves. But enough rambling, let me talk about what I like about Coil now. Alright, so most important question right off the bat. Is Coil fun to play? My answer to that is yes. Coil is another pretty aggressive fighter similar to Biographs and Skateboard, focusing on a heavy rushdown playstyle. Coil's mobility is definitely the worst out of the three. It's still good, but in comparison to the other two, it's nothing special. As a trade-off for worse mobility than those two, his survivability is much better than the other two. He's still a pretty fragile fighter, but he's much more tanky than a Biograph or Skateboard. His forms are all pretty fun to use, with my personal favorite being Gravity Form. It's his best form for damage as all of his cooldowns here do a pretty good job of chaining into each other, especially M2 and E. Gravity Form's E might just be one of my favorite moves in the entire game. Hitting this is insanely satisfying. Speed Form is also pretty fun, but it's mainly just good for closing a gap quickly. At first it seems like this is the best mode for damage because of how fast the M1 is, but since he only has one cooldown capable of dealing damage, Gravity ends up beating it. Speed is still the go-to way of closing the gap and has some really stupid quirks to it that I'll get into later. Regen is his last form and actually used to be my least favorite, but after getting more used to it, Regen has grown on me quite a lot. I play most of this on Regen Form's E since his guard stance is just really fun to use. It absorbs a stupid amount of damage, reminds me a lot of a foul counter on Katana. Instead of dealing a ton of damage on Reflect, I just heal though. With all his forms mentioned, now is probably a good time to talk about his universal moves, or in this case, just move, since even his M1 isn't universal. Coil's one universal move is his Q, which is the tether that lets him buff his allies. The strength of the buff is actually tied to how high your style meter is, so if you're not balling out then you aren't giving out much of a buff to people. However, now that we're talking about support on Coil, I think now is a good time to talk about my biggest gripe with Coil. He just doesn't feel all that much like a support, nor is how he supports his team very engaging. Just attach a tether to somebody and start punching. Playing more like Biograph and Skateboard is a double-edged sword to me, because yes, it does create a more unique playstyle for Coil, but it comes at the cost of feeling a bit lackluster on the support end. Maybe this is a stupid take, but it's how I feel. His support really just feels minimal, it doesn't have much interaction. It doesn't help that each buff you can give is objectively the best in a certain category. Speed is the best for melees, Gravity is the best on ranged, and Regen is the best in supports. You can give any buff to any fighter and it can be useful, but there really isn't any unique synergies here. I like to look at my team and think about who would the best support be in this comp to play. With Coil, I'm never really thinking about that because he just feels more like a melee to me, so I'm not too focused on what my team is. It could just be a me problem, but as it stands right now, I'm just not a fan of how uninteractive support feels on Coil. I'm not trying to say he's a bad fighter or that he's unfun, I still really like him. In terms of fun, he's in the middle of the support fighters for me, but even judging him among them feels a bit weird because of how little of a support he feels like. Sorry for the little rant. I just feel like I should get my biggest issue of Coil off the table. I'm sorry if it's a stupid point, or if I'm dead wrong. If my feelings change about him down the line, I'll go ahead and make another video about Coil. But for now, let's go back to the fun stuff. Anyways, do you want to learn how to fly? So remember when I was talking about his speed form has some quirks to it? Well, here we are. The quirks. Not too long after Coil was added, hell, not even 24 hours later, there was already some tech found for him. This tech is known as trimping. Trimping isn't something just exclusive to fighting, but rather something that exists in a lot of games. Watch the Team Fortress 2 Demo Night video if you want a good demonstration of how it looks in other games. Hell, even when it comes to fighting, Coil isn't even the first character who can trim. Skateboard has been capable of trimping well before the launch of Coil. The biggest difference between Skateboard and Coil trimping, however, is that Coil's trimping is actually somewhat controllable and manageable. In speed form, if you use M2 or E, you can trim pretty far, giving Coil a very useful boost in mobility. Now a fair warning, using M2 to trim can be very, and I mean very volatile. This should be good enough. I do highly recommend applying tripping to your games as Coil, if you're interested in playing in them, that is. It is an extremely useful mobility tool that can help you look at maps in a new way. If you want a more in-depth explanation, I'll link this video in the description. I highly recommend watching it since actually using this trick in game can be pretty useful. That is if you don't overshoot into hell. Okay, back onto more normal stuff. So, how strong is Coil looking so far? Well, my prediction about him being insanely overpowered was thankfully wrong. He's actually a lot more balanced than I thought he'd be. At best, Coil feels like he could be around the top of A tier, and at worst, top of B tier. I'd say he's probably in the middle of support strengths-wise, definitely not as strong as Boombox, likely not as strong as Subspace, but when it comes to Mecha and Vine Staff, he seems stronger than both, but only time will tell. I'd also say when it comes to the fighters we got in Wave 5, he's in the middle of them as well, with Scythe being the strongest fighter introduced in this wave. Though, once again, this could very easily change since we are extremely early in the Coil's life cycle. Okay, enough completely ignoring it, let's finally talk about Coil's finisher, because it is really fun to use. Frostbite Fusion is easily my favorite finisher, and maybe even just my favorite ability in the entire game. Like, look at how Coil looks in Fusion mode. He actually looks oddly familiar. Huh. Okay, but onto attacks. Initially, when entering Fusion mode, Coil is granted the ability to dash straight into somebody and slam them to the ground. This is easily what I was looking forward to do the most when it came to Coil, and god damn it feels amazing to hit this. And the other moves certainly don't miss either. M2 is especially a highlight here. It's just so good. Frostbite Fusion is a really similar feeling finisher to Biograph's Overdrive, but this one just hits so much harder, though don't be afraid to fight him while he's in this mode. If you back down, that lets him steamroll you pretty hard. This mode just feels like you're going up against a raid boss and I love it. Coil hits like a truck in this mode, he's ruthless. Though, he only gets a very short amount of time in this mode, so as soon as he's out of Fusion mode, ransack him for all of his health. Now that's all the really important stuff about Coil, but there's actually some other things about him I want to talk about here. A fighter isn't just a moveset, you know, there's character and design here, and I really like this stupid guy's design and dialogue. First of all, yeah, he just looks really cool. It is admittedly a pretty simple design, but I really like it. Highlight is of course a different colored horn still. I just find the idea to be so sick. The crystal lodged into his color changing horn is also really cool looking, and it's pretty cool to think that we have our third fighter for crystal here. Though something to note is how different Coil's crystals are compared to Medkit and Subspace's. The most obvious thing here is that this crystal isn't floating above his head unlike Medkit and Subspace's. Instead, as mentioned, it's jammed straight into his horn. Plus, when he enters Fusion mode, half of his face becomes crystallized. Guess that explains the Frostbite part. While the crystals accept Medkit and Subspace, it's very clear Coil is not in the same boat. Medkit and Subspace haven't experienced any crystallization due to their crystals, and Coil is constantly called a crystal criminal by Biograph. In fact, it is literally the only thing he says to Coil. Speaking of Biographs kinda, good lord does Coil hate everything about Subspace, calling him a deadweight, an old man, and a corpse in all of his dialogue with him. Speaking of dialogue, it's just really funny. These are some of my favorite lines in the game, especially his interactions with Banhammer. And that's how I feel about Coil so far. A pretty fun character with some good gameplay. Down the line, I'll make a more in-depth video about him, but for now, I think I've talked enough about him. Have fun at the rest of the festival. I'll see you later.